Coming up, Zach Lowe gives a perspective on Cam Thomas around the NBA, potential trade case scenarios from all of our fans, not to mention the loss of one of the all-time NBA Woj Bomb reporters. We dive in, coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. He's Doug Norrie. I'm Adam Armbrecht. We thank you, as always, for making us your first listen of the day. We are 100% free on all those great platforms. And let you know that now through September 22nd, coming up soon, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get 3 weeks free of the NFL Sunday ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com to get started today. And Doug, kicking things off on a Fan Take Friday involves a little bit of a concern around how the NBA views Cam Thomas, something that we have often pondered about over the last couple of years in Brooklyn.
Yeah, Zach Lowe had Steve Jones Jr. on the Lowe Post podcast the other day. They were going through sort of like reasons to watch the bad teams, and the Nets obviously are one of the bad teams. So they were kind of
I don't need a reason to watch my bad team. Thank you very much, Zach.
It's not you and me, buddy. I don't know where he's there. So they were going through, Noah Clowney, Nick Claxton. They were going through a couple of other things, and then the Cam Thomas came up, and Zach Lowe was, I think, paraphrasing what he believes an overall sentiment by NBA front offices. So to be really clear about this next quote, he is not quoting a specific NBA front office person, nor is this his opinion. He actually pushed back on this next quote as whether or not this was his opinion. He said he disagrees with it. But as a guy who talks to a ton of front offices and front office people, this is what he felt was the vibe on Cam Thomas. And he said, quote, front office people who probably don't watch Cam Thomas would say no, not even for the minimum. And just to kind of like wrap that in a bow, what he's essentially saying is there's a sentiment around the league that he believes of people who make some of these higher level decisions. By the way, front office doesn't just mean GM. It can mean lots and lots of different people that work within the organization, that there's a group of people that are just so far out on the Cam Thomas business and experience that they wouldn't even do this. Now, again, hyperbole, sure, a little bit, but it's, again, for the umpteenth time, speaks to the overwhelming polarization around a guy like Cam Thomas, where it really feels like there's no middle ground. It's either you love him or you just want him so far away from what your team is about, like analytically. I'm not sure. So that was just a really, really interesting quote by Zach Lowe.
And it is interesting that there could be that much of a polarizing conversation around a player who, relatively speaking, as we've talked about, to the umpteenth time over the course of the podcast, was buried, couldn't get opportunities, couldn't get developed for the first 2 seasons. Then finally, this past year, plays in 66, starts 51 games, and you really get to have a full sample. And guess what? He scores over 22 points a game. Like, it to the first part to me is it seems odd that this is that much of a potential talking point around the league. But then also inside of it, I think when Zach Lowe is encapsulating other GMs and probably putting his perspective on it, who haven't watched him play, that's my favorite part. So this is the opinion of potentially front offices and scouting departments, guys that are thinking about moves you could make. Cam Thomas in a contract extension season upcoming. This is like the perceptual association of what Cam Thomas represents potentially, not even about what is he capable of doing. What have we really seen him doing? Because if you are another NBA team, were you really dialed into what Cam Thomas was doing last season with the Brooklyn Nets? Probably not. Things did not go the way you hoped early for Brooklyn with Mikal Bridges and with Cameron Johnson. So he's probably off the radar. So it just seems like this is like a narrative built on the possible perception of a player and less maybe about what looks different from year 1 to year 2 to year 3 and where we think this player could go in the next 2 or 3 seasons.
Yeah, it's always, to me, it's always seemed to be a perception problem, right? Like from draft night on, right? Like he slipped in the draft, like he fell to the Nets in the draft just right out of the gate. We're not even sure. We've never been known why, right? Like he was mocked to go higher. He fell to the Nets on draft night. No one ever explained sort of why he fell down draft boards. So starting right from the beginning of his career, there's been disagreement. Then he gets to the Nets. for years of us just being like, how do the Nets feel about Cam Thomas? No idea. No idea.
No.
Like, it seemed like
by the way, one of the sentiments that Zach Lowe is representing when he talks about GMs around the league, he's talking about the Nets GM Sean Marks as well.
They did him no favors.
Sure.
They did him no favors when it comes to this. Like the Nets seem to be the most out on Cam Thomas of any organization after they drafted him because they never even played him. So, and then where it's like, and then going to last season where he's not even starting and on and on and on. And it's just been like this forever. So it's been like this with his own team. It's been like this, obviously, league-wide, if Zach Lowe's kind of intimating that this is a perception among others that are, in the front offices. And it's still, I think, a perception around the fan base, even though Cam Thomas does have some ardent and diehard supporters out there, of which we know. How do we know? Because anytime we tweet anything about Cam Thomas, a million people come in that just love the guy. Fine, that's great. It's great I like that happens with the fan base. But this is just so part and parcel to the entire Cam Thomas experience. And I'm going to tell you right now, it's not going to even get better this year. Now, he might get better. But
the team's going to be bad. So the polarization of what he is and what he can do is going
to will not cure itself this year, because he can do anything. And they're just going to say, empty stats, bad team, because that's just the nature of the Nets. And I'm not saying I believe that to be true. I'm just saying that the polarization won't even stop this year, even with a 6th season, because there's too many other issues with the Nets on a systemic level that people are going to feel like it's not a good window into Cam Thomas. I'm telling you right now, that's going to happen. And it's just so funny. Like, we're just years and years into this with Cam Thomas.
And it's interesting, too, because I think you mentioned the Nets draft a player like this. He's still a young player. So when you mention fans that'll come to the defense, quote unquote, of Cam Thomas because of what the organization has done and how the organization has had missteps at a high level, let alone an individual level with his development. But you go back to this past season, and I do think it's interesting to look at the Mikal Bridges. Well, when you first make that trade for Kevin Durant and you bring him in, you represent the value and still being a competitive team. Even though Mikal Bridges is still a very good player and is going to have a very good run with the New York Knicks. Like, I hate to break it to Nets fans, like, it's going to look really good when you're on a better team with better talent. But the fan base is ready to turn on that. And we examined it too, just from a pure play standpoint. Hey, Mikal Bridges does not look like the player, did not take the next step that we thought he might be capable of coming over to Brooklyn. But when it comes to a young player in Cam Thomas, it's very easy to, look at the organization, because they've made missteps like this, and say, you guys have held him back. You're making it harder for him to advance and become a better player. And I think it's also easier to give that runway on a player going both directions. If you're supportive of him, you say, well, he's still young. Like, he's still developing. The other side of it is, but this is why he fell in the draft. And this is why you haven't seen the Nets give him more opportunities, or this is why he wasn't a contributor in his first 2 seasons when you still had Kevin Durant and these players that maybe could have used a microwave scorer coming off the bench. So it's one of those rare situations probably where I understand why the pendulum swings in both directions and can swing pretty violently both ways, because there's never been this iteration of organization, player, and team where the sample size can all correlate to feeling like you have a real understanding of what Cam Thomas can be on a playoff caliber contributing team, regardless of what individual opinions might be.
And I have one more point about this too, about just highlighting sort of like where he is compared to some of these other players right now, because we're going to put him back in this elite company here with the scoring style. I'll get to that here in just 1 second. First, going to tell you about our friends over at FanDuel. Look, we told you at the beginning that you're running out of time here. You heard us talk about FanDuel. It's America's #1 sports book right now through September 22nd. Today's September 20th, folks. Look at your calendar. You got 2 days here. All FanDuel customers, give it $5. You get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. YouTube TV base plan, you're going to be able to watch every regular season NFL Sunday afternoon out of market game. You just need a Google account. We got one of those. Current form of payment, you got one of those too. Cancel at any time. Look, FanDuel wants to hook you up to make sure you're fully covered every Sunday with the NFL. Don't worry about, if it's out of your market, don't worry about any of that other stuff. You're going to get the NFL Sunday Ticket. You just got to bet $5 all through September 22nd. Just visit FanDuel.com. Download America's #1 sportsbook.
All right, so as we continue today's Locked On Nets episode, obviously taking a look not only around some narratives on Cam Thomas, but we'll also get into your fan takes, plus a big shift in how we will digest NBA information when it comes to our number one reporter on the streets and maybe in your hearts, depending on how you perceive him. What was your last takeaway on Cam Thomas and as he compares to other players maybe around the league?
Yeah, so if you look at right now, our friends over at FanDuel, on their scoring leader odds, he is actually all the way up to 8th now, right? Like he was at 12th before. He's actually all the way up to 8th at plus 4,000. So it's still a long shot. Luka, Embiid, Shea, Giannis, Trey, Brunson, Edwards, Cam Thomas, Ja, Donovan Mitchell, Victor Wembanyama, Jason Tatum, blah, blah, blah. That's the list.
All those guys on that list are in the same kind of pool where there's uncertainty, right?
Okay, a one comp here would be Trey at plus 2,000, where it's like where if you're like, okay, I want to put a Trey, but no one's denying that Trey's like, was at the time a max player and the Hawks should have done, should have signed him and all this other stuff. Now, there might be questions around like sort of like how far your team can go if he is your best player. I agree with that, but no one's going to put Cam Thomas into like even like people won't even put him into the Trey category right now. And spare me one for a second because I'm going to rant about this.
No, go ahead. Please.
With Cam Thomas, guess what? There's a ton of bad teams with players on the teams. No other guys show up on this list. Okay. And it's like, okay, bad stats or bad team, empty stats. Great. Now do all the other bad teams, empty stats guys are on the list. Guess what? There aren't any on this list. There's tons of bad teams with guys who would love to chuck all day long. And some do, by the way. They do not show up on this list because they're just not good enough. And like, this is what I find so funny about this. Oh, empty stats, like, sort of straw man argument. It's just like not true because you have lots of other guys who try to score and have scoring ability and are on bad teams that don't even come close to sniffing the scoring ability of Cam Thomas. So say what you want about the part where he's on a bad team. I get it. We totally get it. He's going to have a little more free reign than most of the other teams. There's just like no other comps for players who would even be allowed to try because they're just not good enough to do it on the offensive end. And that's where I find like the argument to me just falls down.
And you mentioned there, even with Trey, that's a guy that got the money. They tried to do the version of that with the franchise and to build.
They went to the Eastern Conference Finals. They like again, they outkicked their coverage and they probably ran a little hot, right? Sure. That team with him as the best player made it to the Eastern Conference Finals, and you cannot take that away. I don't care about any of their stuff. You know how you have to be a good team to do that. Like at some point, you have to be a good team to be able to do that. So I get it. I'm not a huge Trey fan. I'm glad the Nets didn't trade for him anything. I would not want him to be the best player on my team. But no one even puts Cam in his category. So even if you want to put him on this like bad team stats guy, that team has at least won stuff in the past.
Yeah. And I wonder too, the last note on that I would say is, and this is giving a lot of credit to BME people around the league, is that do you look at situations like Trey and like the Hawks and what they accomplished? Now, again, Nets would sign up for, hey, if we could have Cam Thomas be the best player on our team and get to the Eastern Conference Finals, that would be a real accomplishment. I wonder if NBA teams look at that sample and say, this is the cautionary tale about giving a max contract to a guy and trying to build around him, making that decision, and then reflecting back and saying, right, there is a difference between being this elite level scorer versus being a number one on a team like a Luka, like any of these other guys that we know we always talk about that can do it in a way that impacts the entirety of the game. That being said, Cam Thomas is deserving of far more than being perceived as a guy that wouldn't even, as Zach Lowe mentions, minimum, as the NBA league is saying, not Zach Lowe. But it has to be. Like, it just seems so insane to sit here and say, we don't know if we would even want to touch him if it was, let's just bring him in for a tryout effectively. That seems objectively nuts.
And by the way, I wouldn't give him a max contract either. Like,
but there's something
I'm in that camp too.
Vet minimum and max contract that
he does not strike me as max contract guy either. He's just not that kind of guy. Like that list should be pretty short, and you have to be basically a two-way guy, and you have to be all this other stuff, right? Like, so, and I get it. And so I wouldn't do that either. I'm just saying that, like, to go the other direction is insane.
By the way, I'll throw this out there very quickly. I was curious about other players that like would kind of fall into like the scoring category, but that also maybe represent like not a lot of defensive value. And these are three non-comp skill set necessarily players that came up when you're just trying to, mark down points scored per game, defensive rating, and just saying, do these players have value around the league? And I'm bringing these up to illustrate where Cam Thomas's value is. We don't know for sure. But guys like Jordan Clarkson, guys like Lou Williams, guys like Jamal Crawford. I mean, and some of these players, two of them in Lou Williams and Jamal Crawford, you're talking about guys that in big stretches of their career came off the bench as being elite bench scorers for teams. These are all guys that had no value on the defensive end of the floor, but gave you 20 plus points, 15 to 20 points a night, those type of roles, while being, 115 to 117 type defensive rated players. Even just that, these are not comps, but even that as a baseline would tell you that Cam Thomas is deserving of and will have a long and successful career earning contracts on teams and finding a way to have success. Or at the very least, if we're having a conversation where he isn't, then I think the NBA is doing themselves a disservice, and several teams will be missing out on an opportunity to have a high caliber player, although many will get in the comments and say he's going to have a whole bunch of great years for the Brooklyn Nets going forward. That being the case, there are some fan takes that we want to get to here, but NBA relative. We talk about Zach Lowe reporting on Cam Thomas. What about little Woj bomb? Let's drop a Woj bomb from Woj about no longer dropping Woj bombs. He's retiring and going back to his alma mater to run the ship there. I don't know. What's your take on that? I know you wanted to talk about it. I found it kind of left field shocking. And then my very first thought from a high level life take was, boy, I bet this will be way less stressful on Adrian Wojnarowski to be running a ship like that versus whatever it takes to be up to date and up to speed on NBA reporting day after day.
Yeah, not like a million thoughts here, but I did want to mention it because one, Woj just completely revolutionized the way basketball is reported to a way that like he actually kind of revolutionized in a way the way sports is reported. In terms of
Pissed
like
people off on NBA draft night very, very quickly.
Yeah, like so the part where he revolutionized just the way we ingest NBA news information that they essentially categorized breaking news as a Woj bomb. That is, and by the way, that's going to be like the Kleenex and Xerox of NBA news reporting. That's how like sort of entrenched he was on that thing. The part where I've always thought and long said that I thought that Woj and Shams, to me, Shams represented like sort of what I would consider to be the 31st NBA organization. Right? There's 30 teams, and then there's one other organization, and it's these two guys through which a massive amount of news and information flowed, much of which never even hit like the general public, right? These guys are used as media arms into the organizational depths of like figuring trades out and value and just like trial ballooning things and seeing how people feel and floating ideas. People can be replaced for sure. And there will be people that step into this void of like sort of news breaking, but I don't think anyone will come anywhere close to just sort of like the cultural impact that Woj had on basketball. He paved the way for Shams to be great too, who's also great. Right. Just what it takes to be part of that and do that is very underrated. And I think Woj was like probably properly rated at this point, just in terms of like how everyone sort of viewed his contribution to basketball reporting. But if you came along in the NBA sort of along the same timeline as Twitter, like you just can't not see that this guy, it's basically like losing a half part of an organization. I feel it's like more than just losing a guy. It's like crazy. I know that people are going to think that's an overstatement. It's really not. This guy, you just can't be this dialed in. Shams and him it's impossible to be this dialed in as these guys were.
And we've already seen those jokes all over social media where it's like, well, now who am I supposed to trust? Like a report comes out about an NBA team or a player and you're like, I don't know. I just, like Woj reports, and it doesn't mean it was always perfect and speculative. And there's a lot of ins and outs to any type of.
He was right a lot more than he was wrong, man.
Oh, 100%. Right. That's the whole point of it, is like just to be able to say, hey, when information is getting disseminated, you felt like you got to a place where more often than not, you could trust it and believe and know that it was going to be coming probably from an organizational side, that it was going to have the vetted information. And then you could move forward with that, assuming that it was more likely to be true, assuming that it was more likely that that trade was coming, assuming that it was more likely that player wanted XYZ, whatever it was. So it is interesting when a void like that opens up and now you go, so who steps into it? And Shams isn't going anywhere, but there's also the other side of it, which is like, it takes more than just one dude maybe to cover the entire landscape of an entire league. So
it'll be in the aggregate. We'll see it happen in the aggregate. It's not going to be like one person. You just can't be, you kind of have to be insane. insane in hit.
Okay, real quick,
hit in a good way. Yeah, but God,
that was the other thing is jobs like that. You and I talk about some of the off podcasts, like different jobs that go on around, especially around sports, where I'm like, oh, I would never want that job. That is one of the jobs. Reporting on NBA updates and having those relationships around the league, but then also feathering the needle of saying enough, but not too much, and maintaining those relationships and talking to players and coaches and GMs, and the level of, oh, it's 3:00 in the morning on trade deadline day and something's going on. Yeah, you're up and you're cracking in and you're doing all that stuff. I mean, the Kevin Durant year, I spent one late night on YouTube live talking with the fan base about it. And I felt like I needed probably a month off after that. Like, it's just the level you have to be dialed in to do that is incredible. So back to his alma mater and hopefully righting that ship, because that's the next thing we want to hear is Woj bombs, but exclusively about a niche college that no one was necessarily interested in getting more information on. Coming up here next, we close out our Friday with obviously some fan takes, a lot of trade speculation getting thrown out there on how we move Cam Johnson, Dorian Finney-Smith. We'll go ahead and knock some of these down to close out the week coming up next. All right, everybody, here on a Locked On Nets Friday, we remind you that you, of course, always make the Locked On Nets podcast your first listen. For your second listen, why don't you tune in to Locked On NBA? There's no off season. Frankly, the off season is almost over, and Locked On NBA provides daily podcast basketball analysis for the national and local experts in 30 minutes or less. No one keeps you more informed or entertained as Locked On NBA outside of Locked On Nets. Available on YouTube, where we get your podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, and it's every single day. All right. We had a few different things here. First one, actually, because we came off of talking about Cam Johnson the other day, Dorian Finney-Smith, trying to again set the table on where value lies. Coming off of YouTube, I thought there was an interesting one for a specific reason of Afro Lore came in. He's a frequent flyer over there, by the way. Nets receive 2025 Hawks first round pick, and the Spurs receive Cam Johnson because the Spurs have a lot of 2025 first round picks. Before I even get into why this is tricky, as we've talked about before, I will say a team like the Spurs, and we saw them do this already, bringing in veterans around Wembanyama and having so many first-round picks in next year's draft class. What's intriguing about this from a Nets perspective is getting one more first-round pick that then I think you could start having the conversation of enticing teams. How many first-round picks will we give you to move back to get us maybe one more higher leverage pick near the lottery or into the lottery potentially? You could make this deal, and who knows what happens with Atlanta that year. Before I say why it's going to be really hard, do you like that idea, maybe from the Spurs perspective, of getting in Cam Johnson?
Yeah, I mean, from a Spurs perspective, with stretch big-ish kind of stretch wings, got around guys like Wemby and CP3 now that can really attacks what's probably going to be pretty significant spacing in the offense. Cam Johnson fits perfectly with that, right? I think that he shot almost 40% from three last year. We know he can still shoot. He can defend enough. That team's a little light on wings and probably a little light on shooting too. So I think that lines up really well for them. Whether they want to just empty the coffers now to bring guys in a win now environment, I mean, it's a little hard to know because they're trying to probably do two things at once here, because Wemby's good enough to go pretty far now and they have a future to think about. But yeah, from the Spurs perspective, I think that's actually a really good place for him to land. I think, I don't know if they would ever do it, but that would be a good landing spot.
And it's interesting because the Spurs, as a reminder, they have 1 through 10 protected Chicago first round pick. They have Charlotte's 1 through 14 lottery protected first round pick. Then they have Atlanta's with no protection, and they have their own. So they have, just like the Nets, 4 first round picks in the upcoming draft. I think it's interesting, as you say, would they be willing to use in a draft class like that one of those first round picks on Cam Johnson? It kind of depends on where they feel they are and how far that they can move that needle. But as a reminder, the problem with this is, who are they sending out? Because you need to make the money match, and they need to clear the size of Cam Johnson's contract when you look at that roster. And, they just gave Devin Vassell, he has his new big contract. You look in behind that, it's Keldon Johnson, who's only making $19 million. Harrison Barnes is now there, another veteran, $18 million. So that's, again, as we've said before, I don't want to, beat it to death. That's always going to be the issue. Even for a team you think like the Spurs, who have been bad and they've had high draft picks, they don't have the cap space to just absorb $23+ million without sending something out. So you'd have to, again, figure out that value point. And that's actually the biggest reason why I think it'd be hard to say, give us one of those 4 first round picks for Cam Johnson. But again, also the players that we need in order to make the money match. It's always that little bit extra. And I just wonder how far back the Nets will be willing to go with this when you also look and see the Spurs have 2 second-round picks in next year's draft class as well. We keep asking that question, where is the value mark when any of these trades? Where is Sean Mark's value line that he's unwilling to go below in order to maybe move some of these veteran bodies?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're kind of probably seeing it now. I also think with Cam, like Johnson, they just like also just don't have to trade him. At some point, it's not the worst thing in the world to have veterans on your team. I've said this many times. A rebuilding team that's going to look totally different here over the next couple of seasons with a million draft picks and tons of young guys. Having guys who have just been in the league a few years and know the systems and know the routines and know how to be a professional and just can like be good locker room influences, that is worth something. I know everyone wants these guys out the door, and I mostly do too. First round picks, I'm happy to do that. I think long term that is better. It's just not a zero to also keep them around. Like we've seen teams bottom out a little bit more than they wanted to when it's just an absolute field day around like what is going on in the court and the professionalism. Like we saw this in Houston a couple years ago, where it's just total mess. And there's just been other examples of this in the past. So having a veteran around, it's having Cam Thomas be on the team is not probably ideal, but it's far from the worst outcome. Yeah, I think, just in terms of just like long-term stuff.
And I actually like when you have a guy like Jalen Wilson and you like him in his development. Like I actually think having Johnson there is a very nice, hey, I can maybe teach you some things. I can help bring you along a little bit here, because you are kind of talking about a 1-to-1 replacement when you look at those two players on the roster and their roles. On that one, obviously, real quick, I'm going to give it 6 crossover dribbles and a Kerry Kittle's wristband. So that's a nice one for you. Thanks for jumping in, Afro Lore. Get out with just one more here, mostly because I think Brooklyn Nets Buzz gets the assignment with Fan Take Fridays with the recent Ben Simmons highlight package with Chris Brinkley going viral. How much does this increase the Nets' chances of an NBA championship in 2024? Doug, I cede the floor to you because he gets it. He understands that this is a needle-moving moment with this video we saw.
I mean, I love when my favorite thing is just when we get tweets like back in the lab. I always want to know who's in the lab right now. Like I saw, we got a Killian Hayes is in the lab tweet the other day, which means you are down real bad for NBA news. Like when we get a Killian Hayes in the lab highlight package, it's like, wow, there's nothing going on. Now with Simmons, I mean, we talked about this the other day. It's encouraging. Finally get some shots. We get some like videos of him just like doing other stuff at the basketball court besides just like lifting dumbbells and whatnot, or kettlebells. So that's good. The shot still looks terrible. So I mean, like there was a video of him taking shots.
Taking bad shots.
And they went in, but like the form is, if there was an NBA prospect with this form, they would be getting completely trolled. I mean, everyone's used to it with Simmons now, but it's all right. Look, if he comes back healthy, if he gets to the basket, then I think he's going to have a pretty good season. But he just has to be able to do that. Like sometimes we know these things really quickly with him. Like if he look aggressive, he's going to the basket, trying to get fouled and trying to like just use his speed and athleticism and strength. If we see that in the first 5 games, I'll be super encouraged. If it's back to just DHOing with his back to the basket at the 3-point line, then we just kind of know it's cooked. I think we're going to know that this kind of somewhat early on, like sort of where he is from a basketball mentality standpoint.
Yes. And on that one, I'm going to go ahead and let you know it is 1 non-called off glass 3 and an Allen Crabbe contract. You took your shot, but it was a bit of a risk.
Man, it's like I'm speechless mostly because I just have like with these scoring systems just I mean, they're obviously vetted and make a ton of sense. So that part of it's
by the way, I want people to know, I don't want to go long here. It's Friday. Everyone enjoy your weekends. I want everyone to know that you can get over to wegotnets.com probably next week. Don't go there yet. It's not up yet. But I'm going to go ahead and start putting up the scores, and you're going to see how they rank. So you'll be able to start to tabulate and navigate where you think you fit inside of this system. It's going to be a beautiful thing all season long to see where you stack up in a very
kind of had like feeling like I want to keep wegotnets.com like somewhat like respectable. And I feel like this is going to
help it. This is going to
something.
Taking it
all
up.
right. We're going to get out of here. It's a good way to end. Locked On Nets, wherever you listen to podcasts. Locked On Nets over on YouTube. Let's get that up to 8,000 subscribers as we get into the season. Totally free for you, and it really, really helps us a lot. Subscribe wherever you listen. Subscribe over on YouTube.
Can I break some bad news here? I was so focused on the scoring system, I don't have a quote available to myself right off here. I'm not superstitious, but I am a little stitious.
I know this
Let's
one.
give that one to Michael Scott.
Yeah, we know that one right out of the gate. That's all right. You saved it, buddy. One of the all-time great poets. We'll be back again next week talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.
Basketball.